He doesn't believe anything he's saying. He doesn't believe COVID's dangerous, or he wouldn't be out with 31 of his closest friends.
Adam Carolla's broadside against California Governor Gavin Newsom was not a gentle critique or a measured policy disagreement. It was a direct, relentless dismantling of the governor's time in charge, delivered with the kind of blunt energy that Carolla has always been known for. What made it land so hard was not just the sharpness of his commentary, but the way he distilled years of frustration into a moment that resonated far beyond his immediate audience. The clash between Carolla's unapologetic honesty and Newsom's polished political persona created a sharp contrast, turning the exchange into something larger than just another pundit criticizing a public figure. It became a reflection of how many Californians, especially those who have felt the brunt of the state's problems, see the gulf between the governor's rhetoric and the lived reality around them. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. Carolla focused on the sheer weight of California's struggles during Newsom's tenure. He painted a picture of a state once seen as the pinnacle of prosperity and innovation now teetering under its own contradictions. The homelessness crisis, which has spiraled into national headlines, became one of the centerpieces of Carolla's attack. He described the tent encampments sprawling across sidewalks, the inability of local leaders to present real solutions, and the hollow promises that kept being recycled year after year. In Carolla's framing, this was not just a matter of poor governance, but of arrogance, an unwillingness to admit failure while ordinary citizens paid the price in declining safety, eroding neighborhoods, and the slow decay of public order. The critique dug deeper into the state's handling of crime. Carolla emphasized how leniency, championed as reform, translated on the ground into lawlessness that residents could no longer ignore. Shoplifting that went unpunished, brazen robberies caught on camera, and stories of repeat offenders walking free formed the backdrop of his indictment. By highlighting these realities, Carolla implied that leadership in Sacramento had chosen ideology over accountability, leaving citizens caught in a cycle of frustration and resignation. This was not abstract debate, but the lived experience of people trying to run small businesses, raise families, and simply go about their daily lives while feeling abandoned by the state's priorities. Carolla also skewered the economic contradictions of California. He pointed out how the state is home to some of the wealthiest tech companies on Earth, yet at the same time bears some of the highest poverty rates in the country. For Carolla, this mismatch symbolized the failure of leadership to translate prosperity into broad well-being. High taxes, complex regulations, and relentless bureaucracy were painted as the culprits behind the exodus of businesses and families leaving for friendlier states. He argued that California had squandered its natural advantages, climate, geography, and innovation, by erecting barriers that suffocated ambition and rewarded only those who had the resources to navigate a system stacked against the average person. The handling of the pandemic became another flashpoint in his takedown. Carolla drew attention to the inconsistency of restrictions, the burden placed on small businesses, and the spectacle of politicians, including Newsom himself, violating the very rules they imposed on everyone else. In Carolla's retelling, the hypocrisy became symbolic of a deeper problem: leaders who governed with one set of rules for themselves and another for the public. He underscored how trust eroded not because of the hardship alone, but because the hardship was accompanied by double standards. The shutdown of schools, the shuttering of restaurants, and the countless lives disrupted became the human cost of decisions that seemed detached from accountability. Throughout his dismantling of Newsom's record, Carolla tapped into the idea of California as a cautionary tale. Once heralded as a dream destination, the state now stood in his critique as an example of what happens when political ambition outpaces practical leadership. He argued that Californians were paying not only in dollars but in dignity, with basic expectations: safe streets, affordable housing, reliable infrastructure, slipping further out of reach. Carolla's delivery gave voice to the sentiment that California's decline was not inevitable, but the product of choices made at the top, choices that could have been different if pragmatism had trumped vanity. The way Carolla framed Newsom's time in charge also spoke to broader national implications. As a figure with presidential ambitions, Newsom's leadership of California becomes more than just a state issue. it becomes a preview of what his style of governance could mean on a larger stage. Carolla, by dissecting the failures of California under Newsom, implicitly challenged the idea that such leadership should be exported to the rest of the country. The critique functioned as both a local grievance and a national warning, giving it a weight that extended beyond California's borders. For those disillusioned with politics as usual, Carolla's bluntness carried a resonance that polished speeches could not match. Another layer of his critique touched on the cultural atmosphere of California. Carolla argued that the state's leadership fostered a climate where virtue signaling replaced substantive problem solving. He highlighted how grand gestures and sweeping proclamations often took precedence over the difficult, unglamorous work of fixing roads, cleaning streets, or making housing attainable. In his telling, the focus on appearances allowed deep-rooted issues to fester, creating a disconnect between the image of California projected to the world and the reality experienced by those living in its cities. This disconnect, he suggested, was not accidental but cultivated, a leadership more concerned with optics than outcomes. Carolla's takedown was also compelling because it came from outside the traditional political establishment. As a comedian and commentator, he wielded humor and blunt speech rather than policy jargon. This made his critique accessible to people who might otherwise tune out political debates. By mixing sarcasm with sharp observation, he transformed what could have been a dry policy argument into something visceral and relatable. That accessibility gave his words staying power, as they could be repeated in conversations not just among political junkies, but among ordinary people tired of seeing their state's problems ignored or excused. The implications of Carolla's dismantling of Newsom's record are significant because they highlight the growing gap between California's image and its reality. If the state is often seen as a bellwether for the rest of the country, then its struggles under Newsom become part of a larger story about governance in an era of polarization and rapid change. Carolla's critique underscored that leadership cannot survive on charisma alone, especially when the tangible conditions of life for residents continue to deteriorate. His words, sharp and unfiltered, echoed the sense that patience with lofty promises has worn thin, replaced by a demand for results that match the rhetoric. As the exchange gained attention, the energy behind Carolla's words reflected more than just one man's frustration. It mirrored a widespread feeling among Californians who have watched their state transform in ways they never expected. The spiraling cost of living, the visible poverty, the businesses closing down or fleeing, and the fraying sense of safety have all combined into a collective unease. Carolla's dismantling of Newsom's tenure gave voice to that unease, channeling it into a coherent indictment that could not easily be brushed aside as partisan or superficial. It was rooted in lived experience, in the visible evidence on streets and neighborhoods across the state. What made the takedown particularly engaging was the way Carolla tied disparate issues into a single narrative. He connected homelessness to economic mismanagement, crime to policy leniency, pandemic decisions to hypocrisy, and culture to superficiality. In doing so, he presented Newsom's leadership not as a series of isolated missteps, but as a coherent pattern of failure. That pattern, in his telling, was one of prioritizing image over impact, ambition over accountability, and control over trust. By framing it this way, Carolla transformed criticism into a story that people could understand and repeat, making it far more effective than any isolated complaint. At its heart, Carolla's dismantling of Gavin Newsom was about trust. He argued implicitly and explicitly that Californians could no longer trust their governor to lead with honesty or competence. That erosion of trust is perhaps the most devastating consequence for any leader, because it lingers long after specific policies or crises have passed. Once citizens feel abandoned or deceived, rebuilding that relationship becomes nearly impossible. Carolla's attack crystallized that sentiment, driving home the idea that the damage done during Newsom's time in charge may be harder to repair than the roads, schools, or businesses left behind. Carolla's takedown also spotlighted how California's leadership style projected a sense of inevitability, as if decline were a natural byproduct of progress rather than the result of mismanagement. By stressing the avoidable nature of the state's struggles, he challenged the narrative that complexity excused failure. His remarks suggested that strong leadership could have redirected California's trajectory if humility and practical problem-solving had taken precedence over ego and spectacle. This framing was especially powerful because it invited listeners to imagine an alternative California, one where opportunity still flourished without being overshadowed by dysfunction, waste, and the erosion of public confidence. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on Adam Carolla calling out Gavin Newsom's leadership? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.